If I ever write my academic book on reality TV and game design, for me, a big thesis statement is casting is game design.
Hello, and welcome to One Cool Thing. This is a new podcast from indie game studio Die Gute Fabrik, hosted by me, Hannah Nicklin. That's right. With Twitter dissolving, blogs being way too hard to find, and me personally being too old to pivot to TikTok, we're turning to podcasts to offer you thoughtful conversations with people involved in making video games. I am one of those people, and just in case you've not heard of me or Die Gute Fabrik before, let's do a little intro. So, I'm the studio lead at indie game studio Die Gute Fabrik. We're based in both the UK and Denmark. And I guess we make kind of mid-scale indie games with core principles of intentionality, excellence, and care. And that's not just in what we make, but in how we make too. Our most recent title was 2019's Mutazione, which you can find on most platforms, and we also have something exciting and new to announce later this year. So stay tuned, like, subscribe, wherever it's possible to do those things, do those things. One of the founding principles of Die Gute Fabrik is interdisciplinarity, collaborating with people from other art forms in order to bring fresh ideas to video games. And that's also what's at the heart of this podcast series. So, One Cool Thing is a podcast speaking with people in and around video games about one cool thing not from games, which is really fascinating right now. I'm going to introduce them and their practice, talk about the one cool thing they've brought to the conversation, and consider how it's shaping how they think about their work. It's this chance to hear more about the practices of cool folks working in games, and hopefully somewhere where we can all reflect on how we think about how we make things. So, without further ado, let me introduce our first guest. So we're kicking off our first episode with Douglas Wilson, a co-founder of Die Gute Fabrik. Doug is originally from the USA, but now lives in Melbourne, Australia. And as well as being a core part of Die Gute Fabrik, is a senior lecturer in game design at RMIT University. Doug is best known by most people for Johann, Sebastian, Joust and Sportsfriends, which are both local co-op games made to make fun between friends. Or enemies, I suppose. I mean, I definitely had someone throw a PlayStation Move controller at my head once when I was playing Joust in an event on a decommissioned battleship on the Thames. They were not my friends.
I was there. I was there, by the way.
I can't believe you were there. And I didn't meet you. Okay. Yeah. Way back when, Doug and I were near each other but did not know one another. Now we do. Yep. Doug also took a lead on co-designing Mutazione, especially with a focus on audio programming and game design. And these days teaches, researches, and consults with us at DGF. Doug, how do you feel about the intro? Anything you want to dispute, add, amend?
Yeah, it wouldn't be me if I wasn't like trying to dispute something. So the only wrinkle, and I just feel I want to like defer a little bit to Nils. When we say co-founder, we're like in a gray territory. It depends on how you define Gute Fabrik. Like maybe technically you could argue that Nils was the solo founder, and then I kind of come on later, but we all kind of were involved in like then founding new iterations of Die Gute Fabrik. So we're like in kind of I think gray territory. I'd probably call Nils the original founder. But,
okay, co-founder of DGF V 2.0.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, thank you so much for helping us kick off the podcast series. I hope that you're stoked about bringing in a cool thing, one cool thing to talk to us about. And let's just kick off with, what is your one cool thing? Okay,
we're also in nebulous territory here. Is this thing actually cool? I want to convince you yes, but I worry that I've brought like the most mainstream possible thing to call a cool thing.
I mean, I like that I've just become the arbiter of cool, which is not why I set up the podcast. I mean, it has to be cool to you, and that's the most important thing.
Okay, good. Okay, so this is very cool to me. We're gonna start super mainstream, but then I'm gonna maybe try to swerve and tell you how this has affected all my creative thinking in the last few years. I want to talk about the very popular reality competition television show, Survivor.
What's your name?
Zach.
Zach, what does it take to win Survivor?
I think we're about to find out, Jeff.
What does that mean?
I don't know. I was trying, man. It sounded cool. I think it was the delivery that I kind of like nipped it on.
So this is a TV show that starts in the USA in the year 2000. It's still very popular to this day. In the US, they have done 43 seasons. Season 44 starts next week, which is wild. They do about 2 a year. At its kind of pinnacle, it was watched by like 50 million people in the USA every week or something, right? Like way back in the day at the kind of height of television in the early aughts. This was as like culturally mainstream as you can possibly get. So I feel a little silly being like, have you heard of this like little television show called Survivor?
Doug, I hadn't. That's the thing, though, and maybe that's an issue with how culturally obtuse I am, or just the fact that I'm used to British media, etc. But 43 seasons, is that the longest running thing that has existed? I don't know. That blows my mind. Probably The Archers, a British radio drama, is longer, but that's
surely soap operas and stuff have been going longer. But in terms of like reality television, that's like a big deal. There's stuff that come close, like The Amazing Race is on season 35 or something. There was, by the way, so I think that's not a coincidence that coming from the UK that's like less known to you. There was a season in the early aughts in the UK, but the kind of format never took off. It is about to relaunch after all this time in the UK later this year, though, I think, and we can talk about this maybe, but since the pandemic, there's been this kind of like renewed interest, people kind of in lockdown in their homes and stuff. So there are like a lot of television shows that have gotten this like huge resurgence of interest, and Survivor is one of those.
Sure. So if you were I'm your perfect subject for this because I'm really not familiar with it, and let's pretend I did no research for the podcast, which is obviously not true. But you're explaining Survivor to me. I've not heard of it before. How does it work?
Oh man. The nerd in me is like, great, 7-hour podcast. Let's do this. Oh man, like, how do we do this in like just a few minutes? Survivor is really what it is a durational social strategy game. And what I mean by that is, 18 people of different walks of life are put on, some tropical beach somewhere. Actually, now they used to do it all over the world. Now it's in the same island in Fiji. Twice a year. On the surface, it seems like this kind of adventure show. Like, how do you build a society with people different than you? How do you go find food in the jungle? But all of that is kind of just like the trappings. Really, what it is, it's a kind of strategy sport, right? These people are competing, and they're building coalitions, navigating votes, and at the end of every episode, and we can go through if it's interesting the exact rules, but essentially a group of the contestants have to vote one of each other off at the end of every episode, and that becomes very deep strategically pretty quickly in terms of building alliances. And then do you betray certain alliances? Are there special powers that protect you from a vote or give you an extra vote? And so it becomes just this kind of complex voting math strategy game. At the end of it, there's finally a winner who wins $1 million or like whatever the prize is, right? The format is interesting because for most of the game, it's like you vote out one person every episode, right? So an episode is satisfying because the episode ends with this catharsis of like, oh my God, who are they going to vote out next? But then at the end, there's like a final 2 or a final 3. The power shifts to the people who are voted out, and then they get to vote of the final 2 or the final 3. It depends on the season. It depends on the franchise. Who do we like the most of these finalists that we then award the money to? So it's not just about voting out. It's like you got to vote them out, but in a way that they still like you and want to vote for you at the end. Yeah. So
I see. Yeah. So what, a core loop of Survivor, let's take an episode as a core loop. How does the core loop look? So it sort of the episode begins and what there are tasks to do because you just got to survive in general.
Good question. So core loop looks like show a little bit of camp life, a little humor, personal interest story. Let's get to know the contestants better. Oh, they're laughing on the beach, or oh, they just found a coconut, or whatever, right? It's a little human interest story. It is reality TV. Then there's a challenge. And this depends on if they're in the team phase or if because it starts usually like 2 or 3 teams that are facing off against one another. And then in the second half, it becomes every person for themselves. But they do a challenge. It's usually like an obstacle course where there's a puzzle at the end. So it's like some blend of like physical and kind of puzzle solving skills. And then the winner of that challenge, either their team is safe that episode, or in the individual saves, I can't be voted out because I've won this obstacle course or whatever. And then it shows them for like, 10 minutes scrambling at camp. Oh, who are we going to vote for? Oh, let's get this person. They're a threat. Oh, they have no idea what's coming. Let's vote for them. And then they come to what's called this like tribal council. Listen, we can like unpack and problematize that, but they're right there at this kind of like big meeting, and the host is there asking them questions. Who are you going to vote out? And they're like either lying or telling the truth, and then they go to a vote. It's the votes read out and with super dramatic music, and then someone's voted out. Maybe they are surprised, maybe they're not, and then they turn to the camera and they have to give like a goodbye confessional, which sometimes they're crying, sometimes they tell a funny joke, sometimes they just are really surprised. So that's the core loop.
Sugar, you are an unemployed, uneducated leech on society. And the only thing I would vote to give you is a handful of antidepressants so that no one else has to be subjected to your constant crying anymore. And maybe if you got some, then it would seem a little more sincere when you are crying about your dead father. You don't deserve the million. Thank you, everyone.
Alrighty. Let's stop pretending I did no research now. I wanted, when I was sort of reading about some of the rule set, I was really interested to find out that sometimes eliminated castaways become like a jury, but the rule set I was reading suggested they become like a silent jury, like almost like a kind of Greek chorus observing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that just really fascinating to me. Like, I don't know if our listeners are familiar with a really, really beautiful tabletop game called The Quiet Year, which is a really big influence on both of us, right? And in that game, you have these like contempt tokens, and they don't do anything. You just take them off the table when someone does something you don't like, or you feel aggrieved on behalf of a member of the community that you're sort of building with this game. And it just sits there on the table, and then sometimes you can sort of put them back. And it's so a beautifully exquisite piece of game design, and yet not functional. And it felt to me like a similar effect. Is that how that works?
Oh man, I love the question. I genuinely wish we had like 3 hours to unpack this, because what you're asking has such a long, rich history. Like, I don't even know where to begin answering. It's a very good question. I had never put 2 and 2 together, relating it to The Quiet Year and the contempt tokens. I actually love that comparison. I think there's like a lot to talk about there. Where would I say? Okay, brief answer to that. In theory, the jury isn't supposed to comment. They are supposed to sit there silently. In reality, though, 2 things are happening. One, at Ponderosa, so back at the hotel, they've all been voted out of the game, but they're not allowed to go back to real life yet. They're at the resort, at the hotel, kind of stewing on having lost, but they're all chatting. So there's this social culture of them kind of winding each other up, or like, this person betrayed me. So sometimes these finalists get to this like final debate about who should be voted for as the winner, and they're surprised that meanwhile all these people have been stewing about so forth that happened in the game. So kind of reading that silent chorus, so to speak, is really important, because you also want to know, you get to do a big final, the finalists do a big final defense at the end. So it's really important to kind of like read the room in terms of what these jurors are looking for. But then, of course, there are seasons where the jurors just can't help but react to some incredible move that's made, or some really funny argument or whatever. So there are interesting examples of seasons where the jury probably are not silent enough, and that possibly impacts the game. And is that fair? But then you could argue, but you can always read their facial expressions. So maybe that was part of the texture of the game anyway. So where is that line? If listeners are interested, so Survivor doesn't just exist in the USA. It's still ongoing in several countries, including South Africa and Australia, as English language versions. Specifically, I can think of season 7 of the South African version. There's a couple jurors, it gets almost so raucous that the host has to tell them a couple of times, listen, you got to tone it down. You're supposed to be a silent jury. So it's a very interesting question about, how formalized should that mechanic be, and how do you, as a game designer or as a referee, so to speak, how do you kind of adjudicate that, and where's the line? And as a fundamentally kind of human social strategy game, the whole format is riddled with these kinds of like soft rules that are hard to, and there's like a million examples we could get into about like tricky judgment calls on certain kind of social rules that the producers have had to make.
John, Tom, you've done everything you absolutely can to bring you to where you are right now. From this point, all the power shifts to these guys, the jury members that you've voted out of the game. They now get to decide your fate. Enjoy your last night on the island. Grab your torches, head on out.
So I have 3 more questions. 2 are sensible questions that as a sensible interviewer I should ask you. One of isn't. It's much more me as a game design brain thinking about how I could break the format, because that's what I like to do with formats when I'm in them. Has anyone ever tried to like communist it? Like say, hey, let's share the prize equally between ourselves and just agree that we're going to do a certain strategy? Like,
very interesting and loaded question. Again, like 4-hour podcast, I'm there. Like, there's so much to unpack on this question. The answer is not really, but the different formats are different. So the US show never talks about this on camera, but as fans of the show, we all know. So the winner gets $1 million or whatever. Turns out the second place person gets $100,000. The third person gets $50,000. There's like a kind of sliding scale quietly for the first 5 or 6 or whatever, how many so there's like some kind of sometimes rumors or speculation that in fact maybe from a pure like expected value statistics point of view, like maybe it's not always in your interest to play for first, and just getting to second or third is like actually winning $100,000 is like pretty good, right? So there's like, and then some fans like that as part of the format because it seems like a just way to compensate people who are getting. Some people think that really impacts the game because now people are happy to just be losers at the end, and does that kind of dull the competitiveness of the game? There are other Survivor-like shows where it turns out years later, we know from exit interviews with contestants, there have been alliances. MTV's The Challenge, I won't go into it, is a famous show where it turns out for years people have been like, we're going to work together. In that show, they're bringing back the same contestants often. So it's very much easier to make preseason deals for contestants of that show. And yeah, they come in with these almost like cartels, which is like, we are going to just share whoever wins of us. We just need to get one of us to the finals because we are going to. So maybe not fully like, let's share it with everyone, but certainly you get these kind of little social cliques sometimes. Yeah.
And before we sort of move on to like how this has impacted your practice, which is sort of the second half of the point of this format, I have a couple of like questions. Has the format of Survivor like grown and changed over all of those series? Like, how have they perfected its design?
Again, hard to know where to start. What I will say is, yeah, it changes every season. They're constantly trying new mechanics. And in fact, that's part of the DNA of the show. Kind of, you're supposed to expect the unexpected. I think that's like a literal quote from Big Brother, which is kind of like a similar-ish kind of social strategy show, which is deliberately every season they're trying to throw in new twists so that the contestants never quite know what to expect. And then part of the skill set is like almost strategic adaptability. But certainly, and that's, you kind of need that for television to kind of keep the format fresh. But to some degree, I would argue, right? Like, so these reality shows are almost like a living game design lab because they're constantly trying new mechanics. More recently, so season 40 of this US franchise celebrates 20 years of the show. It was called Winners of War. It was 20 former winners all playing against each other. It's like super epic. It was, really fun to kind of have 20 years of history in this kind of competition. Since that season, they've redefined the format in a number of ways post-COVID. So that season 40 happens right before COVID. Then post-COVID, the show comes back to life. And so there's been this kind of, you can like chart eras of the show. So we've just entered a very new era and I won't go into details, but it is as a game designer and watching them respond as culture changes, right? Because there's, in general, we don't have time to go into this, but the reality TV, especially in the early aughts, is just like a minefield of like, oh my God, what are these people doing? Like the ethics, politics, aesthetics, like, oh yeah, wild, right? And so it has been very interesting to see the show try to grow with the times, with kind of different social awareness. Sometimes the show has done that very successfully. A good example of that is a lot of former contestants of color, especially Black contestants, lobbied CBS pretty hard after a few incidents to commit to casting half people of color on each season. So already, not just by changing the game system, but by who you cast, the show has been very different since they put in that, CBS, to their credit, put in that policy. I would argue the show is way better now for a whole bunch of interesting kind of political reasons. Now that the casting they've kind of committed to diverse casting. So that's been like for example, just a huge change. And it depends on how we define format, right? But because these shows are so based on the social, it's not just about like mathematical game mechanics. It's all about who do you cast, how do you represent the kind of ideology of the show. So it's almost for all its kind of like awful content, I think reality TV is important not just as a game, but as a time capsule of culture changing. Like it's an incredible bellwether of reflecting the changing values in broader society.
For sure. And like, just as you were describing the format to me a little earlier, I was just thinking of just how exhausted the idea of like, because I immediately started placing myself in and how would I do? And I would have to do so much like moderating for people's expectations of a cis woman and like a white woman, and like gosh, I probably shouldn't lean into some things. I probably should lean away from some things. And like the idea of playing with that, you know, how people perceive women thing is just exhausting to me. But I can also see how that it's just like it's going to lay that stuff bare. And like when people are, you know, treating Black men in a certain way and white women in a certain way, like all of that stuff is going to be laid bare, right?
Yeah.
I was also thinking about that. So I'm a recent convert to Taskmaster. Which is interesting because the problem they've set themselves is they can't ever repeat one of the games that they play, so they have to keep on coming up with games within the format. And the vibe of they've not done too many yet because they've only been going for, I think, like they're in the teens of their seasons, right? But they've done 2 Champion of Champions because each show needs 5 contestants, so you have to wait for 5 series until you can run a Champion of Champions. And honestly, the vibes are so off on those specials because they do such a good job of curating their original lineup. So you've got like someone who's a chaos element, someone who just really wants to win and is going to do something really predictable each time. It's still going to be amusing because you've got the chaos element to contrast against, and some people who you think are going to be a certain way, but then just really surprise you. They curate it so well. But then you get Champion of Champions, which is usually just a bunch of people who really want to win, which just, really strange vibes.
Super observant. By the way, Taskmaster also great, very different than Survivor, but that's also been a big influence on me. I think you're exactly right. If I ever write my academic book on reality TV and game design, I don't know when and how that will happen. But for me, a big thesis statement is casting is game design. And we don't have to go into it on this podcast, but that's both like obvious, but also extremely non-obvious. Like, so of course that's true for a television show where, it's not just for the players, it's also for the people at home. But on like a theoretical level of let's understand the construction of games and play, can we really separate systems from their players? Like we often kind of, as game designers, have tools and concepts that kind of treat those like let's plug players into our systems. But I think reality TV kind of is useful because it's like an extreme case that shows no, that it was always a much blurrier kind of blend as where does the game system end and the human players begin, and what is the interplay between the two. So I really like reality TV as almost like an extreme case that's really useful for kind of complicating, maybe overly kind of simplistic ways of thinking about playing games. Yeah.
Super agree. If anyone's interested, I did a talk for Free Play, which is a Melbourne-based excellent event on well, actually, what is their tagline? Do you know their tagline? I should probably know it.
It's one of the longest. By the way, full disclosure, I have been on the board of Free Play, so so if you don't know the tagline, the festival. I just resigned from the board. We've got some new board members coming in, which is great. What's the tagline? I mean, it is Australia's kind of longest running digital games festival. It's one of the longest, I think arguably the longest running. Like it's been going since 2004, which is really ahead of the curve. So yeah, in any case, I did a talk called "The Player is a Material Made Up of People," sort of arguing for holding the player in our minds as a kind of radical impossibility, essentially, because they're not one thing, they're many things. So that's just a little thing we'll make sure to pop into the notes in case people want to have more thinking about that, for sure. So one last question before we move on to how it's affecting your practice. Just give me like a favorite rule or mechanic or just moment, if you like, over the many series of Survivor. Okay, I'll give you two answers just really quick. So the classic rule that completely changes the texture of the game, that has led to the most interesting kind of strategic moments, is the hidden immunity idol. Right. So rather than you can win immunity for yourself by winning one of these obstacle courses or whatever, and everyone knows, okay, we can't vote for that person, they won immunity this episode. Starting in season 10 or 11, I can't remember which one, they started hiding idols out in the forest on the island. And so you could have immunity that nobody knows about. So they all vote for you. But then right before the votes are revealed, you get to play your hidden immunity idol. Be like, haha, suckers, you all voted for me, but I'm immune. And that leads to these incredible reversals where you might have a smaller group that's totally outnumbered by the bigger group, but with this tool, they're able to turn it around on the bigger group. Now that sounds simple, but as this stacks, like you have now multiple idols and other advantages, very quickly this becomes like the world's most intense, complicated game of rock, paper, scissors. And right, they've added all sorts of flourishes to this as it's got more complicated. Recently, this is a very polarized mechanic. I love this. A lot of the fandom hates this. They introduced a new advantage called knowledge is power. You can play this to say, I'm playing it on you. If you have an idol, you now have to give it to me. And so now this really penalizes people who are too open about telling people about their hidden tricks, because now you can kind of steal it from them. So that leads to all sorts of emergent strategy that's like, as a viewer, to these incredible, like almost heist movie level of like, oh, I'm going to make them think I have it, but I'm going to pass it to my friend. But, oh, really, my friend's in on it. And I'm like getting is a double agent. And now they're actually going to vote for him. So, once you start adding these like little simple rules, you get incredible emergent moments. So it is, this kind of classic emergent complexity strategy kind of deal.
I know that Survivor has been influencing your design and practice for a few years now. So could you maybe describe some of those early works, early designs that began to be influenced by Survivor?
So in 2020, especially Victoria, which is the state in Australia that I live in, has this series of like pretty intense lockdowns, right, to kind of combat the spread of COVID. So me and my partner Melissa and a number of our colleagues, we spent a lot of our time just watching reality TV. So 2020 was this just like intense, and I had always been aware and kind of liked these shows, but didn't know much about them. So kind of since the pandemic, I have basically pivoted all my leisure and kind of intellectual time to thinking about, instead of kind of traditional video games, now this kind of TV type game stuff that I suddenly got really interested, binging TV during lockdown. Anyway, also during lockdown, then partly with my partner. So my partner is a comedian and an improviser, and she has a bunch of theater friends. and we started running our own games online via the chat platform Discord. These durational, almost like our own private reality TV show games, right? Voting people out, strategy, secret rules. Now, this is a pretty well-known form of digital play called ORGs, online reality games. So it turns out since the earliest days of reality TV, there have been tons of fans on forums, on Discord, on Skype, on whatever, platform you give them, who've been playing their own little fan-made Survivor games, right? And not for money or anything, but just, people playing it over a weekend, a month, 2 months, whatever. So this is kind of like sometimes not, I feel like the video game industry doesn't kind of often think about or talk about this kind of play, but a pretty active form of kind of informal, organized play, multiplayer play, with kind of free digital chat tools. So anyway, as a game designer, I love, and I've played a few of these, but of course I didn't just want to run Survivor. I wanted to make my own format. So under lockdown, I made my own format called Factions, which, I took all my lessons about these games and tried to be like, okay, well, what if instead of doing it like this, we did X, Y, and Z? So that's where kind of like, as a game designer, once you watch enough of these TV shows, you get the itch like, oh, look, but I want to make these games too. And so, being able to play those games with friends under lockdown is kind of where a lot of this starts from.
And so I can imagine Survivor now so you've taken us through a lovely tour of it. But I can imagine chatting with friends in a Discord. But what does playing one of these sort of these reality games on a Discord feel like?
Varies greatly. So there's lots of different forms of it. A kind of classic one would be like, it's just the server's on 24/7. You're possibly playing even with people around the world in different time zones. And, there's certain deadlines by which you have to send in your vote or play a little mini game with people online. The one that I ran, because we didn't kind of want it to take over your life, it was open the game lasted a week, and you would, there were earmarked times. So we would say after dinner from 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. every night, that's opening hours, and that's when you're allowed to message people. And by 10 p.m. you have to send in your votes, and then at the beginning of the next day, I'll announce who got voted out, and we play again. So it was almost like an organized, like me and my tennis buddies meet every Sunday to play tennis. Instead, it's like me and my reality TV buddies meet up a few hours every day or week or whatever it is to play this game online.
And were you role-playing being like in a situation like on a desert island or in a bunker, or was it just more like we acknowledge the frame of this? We're in Discord, we're playing mini games, and we're just dealing in DMs to try and convince people to vote for or against us?
Some people, especially like fans of the show, do more role play. I'm what you might call a game bot. Okay, no, I'm in it just for the strategy. We're not going to pretend anything. We're like just on this server, and we're going to vote and do all the strategy. So the game I run is very not narrative heavy. But it depends. There's some that are like extremely role play heavy.
And an example of a mini game that you might play, maybe?
Difficult question, because my whole theory is, what if Survivor didn't actually need the challenges?
Okay.
Right. These like weird obstacle courses you do. And they're important on TV, right? Because they're beautiful to watch. They add stakes. But to some degree, you could argue, but is that the real game? Sure, you're playing for immunity. But if we're going to really talk about the core design pillars of Survivor, that like surviving on the island, doing the obstacle courses, that's all set dressing. Really, it's a voting game. It's a threat reduction game. How do I make myself not seem dangerous so that I can make it to the end? And so in the game I run, there are no mini games that you on different secret teams, and you're trying to figure out who's on your team. And there's one mechanic called basically a team share, where two of you decide to kind of share your team color. And then it's really basically just like a figure out the secret rules, put together votes, build coalitions, and try to be the winning team.
So this probably leads us into where this is affecting your practice now, how this is affecting your practice now. It strikes a lot of similar chords for me from the mid-2000s interactive theatre that I was involved in. So there's a really beautiful piece by a company called Coney called A Small Town Anywhere, where you're sort of cast as a role, but you're not role playing in a sort of traditional sense. You're just given a hat. You get given a hat if you're the mayor, and a different hat if you're the poet, that kind of thing. The idea is that there is a traitor in your midst, and you need to uncover them. And it's got all these things that you sort of like they describe to you a core loop of a day, and you go through those things. But at the end of each day, you have to decide whether or not to essentially cast someone out. Equally, actually, probably the most powerful one of those that I was ever a part of was a show called The Money by a company called Collider based out of Bristol. And in that game, everyone who's bought a ticket, all of the money that your tickets cost gets put in the middle of a table, and you all sit around the table. And you have to decide together, you'll sign a contract at the beginning to say that you're going to decide together how to spend the money, but the vote needs to be unanimous by the end of the hour in order for that to be true. And if you do not achieve a unanimous decision, it then rolls over into the next day's play, the next performance's play. And I was really, really annoying to everyone around me when I played that game, because everyone was going, oh, let's give it to a charity. And I was like, that's not interesting. I'll give it to some charity later on because I feel bad for saying that. But also, that's not interesting. Like, why don't we just think radically about money for a moment here? We've got the opportunity. And they're all going, who is this lady? Why is she? No, please make her go away. Anyway, I made it roll over like a complete puck character. In any case, that hopefully leads us to what I know a little bit about, which is that you are now taking some of your thoughts on Survivor and what you were just sort of telling us about into performance, right?
Yeah, so two different strands of this. So I think there's so much to unpack here, but I think part of what you're getting at, which I think does end up leading me to theater, and I don't have a traditional theater background, by the way, but you start realizing, this seems obvious in the era of Twitch streams and stuff, but games are not just for their players, right? Games are played and watched at different levels. So you have maybe the contestants actually in Fiji, but then you have all the people at home watching. And in fact, you're not just watching. I'm really interested in the fact, like, watching and play are much, much messier, more messily intertwined than sometimes we'd like to admit. When I'm playing Survivor, you're with your friends guessing what is the edit, what are the producers trying to, like, you're almost playing this prediction game, and then the production team has to change their editing style so that it's more surprising. So it becomes this kind of cat and mouse prediction game, right? And people have draft pools. People are playing their own kind of house games about watching Survivor. So it is a game for the people in Fiji. It is a related but very different game for the people on the internet watching at home. And, I think this is inevitably true of theater, right? There's the experience for the players on the stage themselves and the people in the audience, and we can start messing with that boundary in an infinite different number of ways, right? Okay, so two things that where this has really taken with my practice. Because my partner is a comedian and really enjoys genre prov specifically, so taking a specific genre and doing improv around that. So she's part of an improvised Shakespeare performance group here in Melbourne. So she has and a kind of improv comedy. So we decided to do completely improvised Survivor, and so and Melissa, my partner Melissa McGlenzie, is the kind of lead on this. But with her and a bunch of her improv colleagues, we run the finale of a fictional season of Survivor based on suggestions from the audience at the beginning of the show. And it is kind of like a comedy, both like a love letter to, but also like a kind of critical satire of the show and reality TV spoofs. Reality TV tropes. And so I've been involved in the kind of planning of that and some of the game design aspects of that. And I do some of the sound. I don't play on stage. I'm not a comedian or an improviser. But that's been super refreshing for me, right? As someone with more of a fine arts and a video game background to now get to jump into this kind of sibling discipline with my partner who's an expert. And for us to find right, like I've typically like, improv comedy, I'm not really into that. And Melissa's been like, video games, I'm not into that. But to like find this kind of magical intersection, actually, it was all just play all along. Spoiler, right? So it turns out there's actually a huge Venn diagram between our interests.
There's a thing that I tell students, which sounds fun. I just like the way it sounds. I say to them, theatre is a game that's so old, people forgot it's a game.
Yeah, 100%.
Because it's play, it's rule set. We all pretend certain things, we agree certain things. And some of the most interesting theatre that I was involved in the sort of experimental devising and interactive theatre sphere was always interested in making new rules for that old game. So let's sort of pretend for a second that I'm sat in the audience of Improvised Survivor. Sort of, how does it feel? How does it start? How does it work?
You the 5 minutes before the show, as people are like shuffling into the theater, there are slips. You don't have to, but you can write down a suggestion, occupation, an object or whatever. And those are the suggestions that at the beginning, the contestants run in. There's a fake Jeff Probst, who's the host of USA Survivor, music, and there's lighting, and they run on with, in Survivor-like clothes, and they take a suggestion slip, and they build these characters after them. And so it's like a hour-long show, and it's billed as kind of like, oh, this fictional season, the finale to a fictional season of Survivor that will never be seen again, right? So it's different every night. It's always kind of comical, but they do a previously on montage, right, where they're building the kind of what happened in the season, and then they actually do a challenge. There is a winner, and they go to an actual tribal council where they vote somebody off, and then the audience gets to kind of be the jury that votes for the winner at the end. And so what's really nice about that, which kind of really speaks to a bunch of our interests, it's very Taskmaster-esque, which is it's fictional, but they're having a real competition, right? Like they're actually competing at this game. They actually want to win for the reputational credit. So they have to, like in Taskmaster, where's the right balance of like trying to be funny for the audience versus I really want to win this, and trying to strike that balance. Some of the players have occasionally formed alliances before the show. Like, okay, Pedro has won the last 3 shows. The audience love him. If he gets to the finals, he's going to win. We have to vote him out, right? So they're both playing fictionally, but also not, right? Of course, the boundary between fiction and reality is a lot blurrier than we would like to admit sometimes. So that's what really excites me kind of creatively about this. Again, very much like Taskmaster in this, let's make there be real stakes so that this is kind of a game show, but it's also really not about winning. And if we took it too seriously, that would not be that enjoyable for a bunch of reasons. I'm such a recent Taskmaster convert that I am listening to the podcast from the beginning. And actually, it's really good. And also one of the sort of perennial questions for all these comedians is just like, how do I play this? Because I am, for the first time, myself. I'm not like a version of myself, the character that's myself when I do stand up. I'm not my clown that I've taken so long to build. And like occasionally my clown will come out, but occasionally I'm just really trying hard to understand what this task is asking me to do. And I haven't got, like, I have to just be that. And I don't know when to play into it and when to lean back from it and stuff. And it's just really fascinating to hear that, I think, as a, I mean, to me, like there are reasons I personally play games, which are very different to the reasons I make games. And for me, the reason I make games is because people are interesting. Games are interesting because people fascinate me. And I make theatre with people because I'm interested. A lot of my theatre was connected to sort of community practices of working with people to sort of listen to them about their lives and use formats to sort of tell their lives back to them and those kinds of practices. And then I discovered games as this practice which could reach a lot more people because it's digital, and which is, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I mean, technically, Metacione has 3 million downloads, right? All of those people are sat in a different place and from a different context. And like to make a thing that can sit in all of those places and hands and context is just really fascinating to me. I don't know if that's sort of part of the thing that's chiming with you. You're not wrong. But coming from video games, I'm like running the opposite way almost. Okay, yeah. Which do you know what I mean? Which is like, oh, like I'm so tired of making these things that are like distributed to like faceless people who I'll never meet. But now doing this theater show for 60 people in a packed room is like amazing. And I can see all their faces like live reacting to whether this thing is like working or not. So, and the real answer is right. None of these things are like quote unquote better than the other, but like having been in the like distributing digital files widely for a long time, for me, the pendulum's almost swinging back the other way. Like, let's do a show for 4 people, but make it like the best thing that they've ever seen in their life. Do you know what I mean? So it's grass is always greener.
So I should begin to wrap us up now because, as you said, we can't talk for 3 hours, unfortunately. If there is a cry from our potential audience to hear that extra 3 hours, maybe we'll come back and chat some more. But in the meantime, I was wondering if there was a final sort of thought or lesson that you'd like to offer the people listening who might be interested in games and game design, like what your one cool thing, what do you hope it offers people?
We've touched on some of the themes, but I'm interested in stuff, really like casting as game design, or actually the boundary between watching and playing. We like to say, oh, play is interactive, and like non-interactive media, you just watch, but like, but actually it's much more complicated than that. And you kind of like all linear media is like interactive in a way once you realize you're playing around all this stuff. So I think that's like not just some sort of like academic observation, but really changed the way that I consume media and enjoy all these TV shows. The only other thing I was going to mention is this I would say, pun intended, jury's still out. Like I'm still on this kind of, I'm pretty new to this area. So in addition to this theater show, Improvised Survivor, that Melissa and I do with the cast, we're also turning me with Melissa, this game I called Factions, which was this online thing, into a podcast. So, okay, what if instead of just for my 20 friends, it was for our 20 friends, but then also we edited it into something that was legible and spectatable, listenable for the people at home. So that's, will that work? We're in the midst of trying that. So that'll be interesting to see what kind of lessons we draw from that. But very much in this mode of, and of course I'm still making video games as well. But let's look at, it's been so refreshing for me to take the time to dive into these sibling disciplines. So that, that maybe that's just like a general recommendation of, if you've been in the same kind of mode or cultural sphere or profession for a while, sometimes it can be super generative to just take one step sideways and kind of transfer your skill set to this kind of neighboring discipline. So that's been super fun and exciting for me the last few years.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of One Cool Thing from Die Gute Fabrik. If you'd like to follow Doug so you can find more about him and his work and the coming soon podcast Factions, which will trace a Survivor-inspired game between him and his partner, well, you can find him in most places as Dougal, which is spelt Dooougle. So it's Dougal, 2 O's. I always put an extra O in, which is not helpful. 2 O's. Melissa, his partner, is also very possibly playing Edinburgh Comedy Festival this year. So if you're in the UK, look that up. And obviously is a part of the Australian scene. So do give Melissa a quick Google if you're interested. For further reading and watching, check out the liner notes in the podcast for everything we've discussed. And our lovely producer Tom Wally also recommends the new UK reality TV series along similar lines, which is called Traitors. I think I'm compelled to ask you to do all the usual things people are asked to do with podcasts, that is, leave a rating or review where you can. If this time was of value to you, then that's a really good way to say thank you. I'll be back soon with a new episode speaking with another cool thinker and maker in the field of video games. And in the meantime, check out Die Gute Fabrik on whichever social media is currently still functioning, which is at least Instagram, Twitter and YouTube at time of recording. This podcast was produced, edited and sound designed by Tom Wally. Additional production research by Unaming Kavanagh. And our theme music is by Nick Ellis, whose music you can find under the name Tenby on Bandcamp. That's Tenby. Stay thoughtful, friends. Take care. Goodbye.